as students, we know how difficult it can be to balance your studies with often a full-time job. So we also want to thank all of the friends and family that have got our graduates to the finish line this evening and celebrate your commitment to supporting your students. So thank you so much for being here, either in person or virtually. And we would like to invite up our first presenter, Justin Hartman.
The mic should be on right now, right?
What was that?
Is the mic working? Oh, I can hold it? Okay, that simplifies that. There we go. There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today talking about this topic. I'm going to be talking about transit deserts, which are one way of measuring transit equity, and to also help define a categorization system about it. So what is a transit desert? Well, the original design behind it was behind John Dillon in 2013, who coined the term. It focuses on this transit gap between transit supply and demand based on transit-dependent populations and transit service. And then someone else came along, Diane Jones-Allen, who wrote a book about it and defined it more as transit-dependent populations being moved to areas of car-centric design where it's hard to access transit or it's unwalkable. What are the components of transit deserts? Well, John Dillon, focusing on this demand and supply, identify transit-dependent population as the demand, but also use supply as this amalgamation of transit stops, transit frequency numbers, and this fixed pedestrian infrastructure. Whereas Allen uses these three different categories of demographics, neighborhood form, and time accessing transit. And they differ in their approach to either qualitative and quantitative approach, with John Dillon being a much more quantitative, but with Allen being much more qualitative. As this table shows, basically that many of the transit desert studies have really focused on the supply and demand fundamentals from John Dillon, with a lot of them using kind of the same definitions. So this is the very prominent definition that they use currently. But the issue is that this is not really the case for a lot of the outside literature, with transit-dependent populations being defined not only by carlessness or by their age groups, with the John Dillon method largely being associated with teenagers, but also with elderly populations, income, race, and disability. Needless to say, it's a very multidimensional aspect that is largely being cut out by this original definition. Transit surface is also kind of cut short just because they use this proxy method that, while it's good for a quick and kind of dirty way of calculation, it's also not a very good way of demonstrating what transit is actually like in those areas. Instead, more studies are using this multimodal approach that sees walking time in combination with transit use, and also this time-based accessibility metric that focuses on origin and destinations. Basically, how many destinations can you get within a certain time from your starting point? And largely that's focused around jobs. And this is kind of a demonstration of where this inaccuracies come from these two methods. The left is John Dillon's map of Chicago, and the right is a different method that focused on using a different definition, but still using the supply and demand methodology. And unfortunately, I don't know how this laser works, but if you look on the top, Chicago, the north side of Chicago, there's transit deserts that they identified that have been reported don't actually exist there. Whereas in the southern part of Chicago, they don't identify any, which in reports have largely, south side of Chicago has been largely associated with issues with transit and transportation. And so it largely misses out in those areas. And in terms of solutions, they have been linked and have been existing and have been shown to be available. But the problem is that there's not really any guide way or any kind of any way of connecting it to different areas, and they're kind of left for planners to decide. For instance, like fixed route transit over these more flexible microtransit solutions like bikes and scooters that you see all over here. And so this is kind of left up to planners to figure that out. And so the objectives, goals, and challenges, get them in reverse order, for this project include the challenges were there are inaccuracies currently. There's disagreements in this qualitative and quantitative framework that kind of reduce the opportunity for both research approaches to be used together. and there's gaps in being able to really focus on where these solutions can be approached and where planners can really use this kind of system. And so my goals were to create a more accurate method that, one, is more accurate, but also is able to complement these more qualitative methods. And so we do that by making just a new categorization, or a new mapping and categorization method. The data, I'll just be quick with this. Census data was the fundamental for a lot of this demographic. So anything you can imagine related to population came from census. This EPA has a accessibility to jobs and workers via transit data set for metropolitan areas in the US. And this is kind of that origin destination accessibility metric that I was talking about. And I used jobs within 45 minutes, all jobs accessible within 45 minutes for this. And the smart location database was used for some of the categorization methods that I will discuss later. All this data was available at the census block group level, which you can kind of see here. So the method, kind of a little mathy here, but there's three characteristics: the demographic index, percent senior population, percent individuals with a disability. And you can think of demographic index as a kind of a combination of percent low income and percent non-white population, which is in coordination with this, with a lot of the literature relating to transit dependency. Zero car households, kind of a fundamental staple of being transit dependent. And this was combined with the AJWT to kind of like for all metro areas in the US. And was all metrics were used relative to their metro areas. So threshold values were generated to kind of depict where these different transit deserts were, depending on the demographics of the 80th percentile if you were above the 80th percentile, below the 40th percentile for your region in transit, and then the zero car or household regional average, if you were above that, then you were considered a transit desert. And so this is kind of a quick overview of the results. You'll notice that they overlap with each other. So this is the top left is every one of them, and then it goes kind of like, like that in terms of the demographics. I made sure to like kind of include all of them in the compilation, but also to ensure that you can identify which one based on their specific demographic group. And so what the results show is that we are able to avoid this misidentification in this within that black border there of Chicago. In the north side, we avoid doing this misidentification that John Dillon did, and also identify the transit deserts in South Chicago on the southern side there. But what we believe that, or what I believe that this did over the map you see on the right that was more accurate than the one on the far left, is that, my map is in the middle, by the way, sorry, is that we're on this far right southeast side, where on the right one you can see that there's no transit deserts there, but mine has a lot around that area. I believe that this shows that this is able to more accurately show transit service rather than just, is there a transit stop there? And I took this to mean that basically we are able to use this to better show how transit acts in response to where people need it. To show that it works with qualitative frameworks, I used Allen 2017, her book, where she identified transit deserts in New Orleans, Chicago, and next Baltimore. Here you can see that in East New Orleans, this entire area, that there are plenty of transit deserts there. And also in these black boundary neighborhoods in Chicago where she identified transit deserts. This coincides significantly with what she was talking about. And I think this at least showed support for these transit deserts. The one area where we didn't was this area in Cherry Hill. The other two are not the actual area, my bad. But Cherry Hill, she identified as a transit desert, but I wasn't able to in this project. But I believe this is because before this, after this book was published, there was a initiative to redesign the entire bus system in Baltimore, and that has been shown to, one, kind of improve accessibility via transit, and two, reduce commute times. And the way I know that this actually happened after the book is that some of the bus routes talked about in the book don't even exist anymore. So the conclusions from this is that it was able to improve accuracy, and it was able to match transit deserts from Allen's book, which suggests that it could support these qualitative frameworks. And then moving on to categorization, I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. It's a binary choice tree. I'll show you what that means. And there's 5 categories. And these categories are based on distance to employment, the proximity to transit, and population density. And so this is basically what it is. I don't, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically it's this system where you go through each question, and based on a certain metric, is it falling in one or the other? And only the first one really matters to like if it goes to the next one. But I have 5 typologies that I use here, and that's basically used to help define what solutions may be best for improving transportation accessibility there. And these are the different groups here. I can publish this later, but this wastes not enough time to go through all of these, but basically there's 5, and they differ based on their different approach and their different solutions. So as sort of like a showcase, we can start here. This is a transit desert in Rockaway in Queens on the very southeast side of the city, pretty far. And so I see if it's within this employment weighted centroid within an 11.2 mile buffer, which is twice the average distance spent on transit, according to a survey in 2016. It's very much outside of that, which suggests that it's a type A. I'll explain what that means in a bit. And then if I move on from that, then I can see that it's also within a fixed guideway transit stop, which means that it's also a type B. And what does that mean? So type A means that its geographical location is probably making it its accessibility limited. And type B means that it's within a transit station, but it's not, it's considered transit desert, so it might be a first last mile issue. And there's some suggestion that these are actually solutions that I identify that can help support this, with type A being associated with network redesign and new transit modes. There's been a proposal for a new train that connects this area of Rockaway, where that transit desert is, to the rest of Queens and into Manhattan. And there's also been suggestions for micromobility and rideshare programs, which are associated with type B. Limitations, I'll go through these very quickly. Geographic conversions, because of just the nature of the data, they don't match up perfectly, so that probably results in some error. The extent of this data set, you can see here that that's Houston on the inside of the extent of the actual data set versus the actual size of the region. It's starkly different, and so you can't capture every area. We assume the highest potential for transit, which is not always true. Threshold values are based off of what the literature has said, but also just what feels like a good number, just because there has been a precedence for this. And so that could also be an issue. You can always change the threshold values, and different timeframes of this data set can also make it hard to actually accurately show what happens when. Policy recommendations, just briefly, there's a 2-pronged approach that's very consistent with other elements of transit. This is to keep transit-dependent populations in transit-rich areas through affordable housing, ETOD, and rent control systems, but also for places that are already out there and are too far away from transit to kind of do that system that I was talking about, where kind of with that categorization tree, but having it context sensitive, because if you have an elderly household, or someone who's elderly living in a household, probably not having a scooter is going to help them, or scooters are not going to probably help them, rather. And that's my project. Thank you. I want to thank my family. I want to thank Sandra, John Thomas, my mentor, and Andrew Burnish, my second reader. And I know she's watching right now. Eva, my girlfriend, she's been a big help through this. And everyone for being here.
Thank you, Justin. And if anyone has any questions, Madeline will be coming around with the microphone. If you're joining us from home, please feel free to type your question in the chat box and we will read it out for you. The question over there.
Really great job. I'm very impressed with the whole presentation and how comprehensive it was. One question I had was, do transit deserts take into account like service time? So even though there might be access to a stop, but it may be only at frequencies of 30 minutes to an hour. I was just curious if that was kind of part of that.
Yeah, actually, so that's the original issue with it. I'm sorry if it wasn't too clear. I was trying to get this through in a time frame, but I can actually explain this. The data set that we're using, the way it's an origin destination system. So what that means is that it runs a calculation that uses, if you start at the a center, they uses the center block groups and use that. they then do like this network analysis where you do walk time, and then it uses something called GTFS, which basically uses like transit schedules to identify if you were to go from one point to another using transit. You combine the walk time plus the schedules of the transit to estimate what the actual service time would be. So yes, it does use service, but the issue is it uses the best possible service time. So like, for instance, I think it's a good estimation, because if your best possible service time is still not enough for like accessing things, then it's probably not good in its reality, like its real form. But it's at least a way of measuring like service better than using buffers or using like how many bus stops are around me. Thank you.
I would like to invite our next presenter, Hailey Kerben, up to the podium.
That work?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Hailey. So today I'm going to be presenting commercial to residential conversions, creating a sustainable mixed-use city. Can they be the solution? The how, what, why they will or won't work. So this is what I'm going to be going over today. So first, typical office space and office culture was already on the decline, but the pandemic quickly ate away at the possibility of that really coming back at the full capacity. So making a city sustainable, attractive, and affordable will help them regain their tax base, community engagement, and economic growth. They will really need to reinvent how we live, work, and play. Conversions are a way for developers to pivot their assets and really create more value out of dying buildings. The conversion process, unfortunately, is often saddled with many obstacles, like strict zoning policies, architectural changes, and state requirements for more affordability. The results and analysis of the Capstone shows that they are not only possible, but they can largely benefit future growth and development. Single-use buildings are not really sustainable and are no longer a viable part of city life. So next, I'd like to start with my dedication. I wanted to dedicate this to my family. The past 2 months have been really hard as I lost both my aunt and uncle due to a tragic car accident. And you know, we all know writing this while working has been really hard, but going through this has made it even harder. And want to be thankful to my parents and my sister, my boyfriend as well, for motivating me every day, and also Eliza, Morgan, and Sandra for guiding me through this process and supporting my wishes to continue this summer. Okay, so first, my positionality statement. As an interior designer and now an urban planner, the concept of conversion sounded very intriguing and highly promising. So I really wanted to get to the crux of the issue and see if it's really possible. And if so, why aren't more cities more rapidly taking advantage of this idea, if at all? As someone who's become increasingly frustrated learning more about the available infrastructure but the lack of affordable housing, I was eager to identify the missing piece. There has always been a supplement of housing demand, but not enough supply. So now that we sit at the peak of surplus of available infrastructure to utilize, how can we really invent the wheel and bring vitality back to cities? A lot of cities that are commercial, like DC, really function from a 9-to-5 workday, where the streets practically empty out after the workday. So cities really need to be aiming to expand the 5 to 9 hours as well. So the proposed vitality, amenities, and increased housing stock should help incentivize people to move back to cities like DC. So first, the why. Why conversions, and why is this even a topic of conversation? If planners and developers can really activate the areas that are currently vacant to be part of the core city life, conversions could be the missing piece to bring back investment and growth. So the 3 ideas here are post-pandemic reproductions, affordable housing, and balance of uses. The National Association for Realtors discovered that 22 out of 27 metro regions that were heavily impacted by the pandemic have market conditions that make office to housing conversions actually really feasible. And as part of the background research provided by the Downtown BID, Business Improvement District, and Golden Triangle BID in Washington, D.C., it was discovered that of approximately 87 million square footage of privately owned office space, 17 million square footage of that, which is about 19.5%, was vacant due to results of hybrid work schedules caused by the pandemic. For affordable housing, cities like DC really do have a lack of adequate and affordable options, which forces rents to increase as demand is extremely high and the supply is very low. Since the introduction of the Housing Downtown program, the commercial property taxes have decreased 9%. And lastly, balance of uses. While expanding inventory is beneficial, it's not the solution to the housing shortage. We, as developers and planners, must be conscientious about creating a mixed-use community in order to formulate economic development and a sense of place. Public needs grocery stores, schools, jobs, and amenities within a 15-minute walking distance in order to make it more attractive to consumers. And next is the how. How do we do this? Developers and architects can almost always physically execute a successful conversion, but what is needed is extensive research in the neighborhood, monetary incentives, and simplified zoning ordinances. So first, current trends. Specifically, I really looked at DC here, and since 1910, DC, as most of you know, has a strict height restriction. So it was initially aimed to preserve views and historical characteristics, but has been troublesome when we're trying to add, as planners, more density into the city. So being able to utilize current infrastructure will really be to our benefit. For market analysis, developers and investors look at submarkets, overall location, current quality of life, transit, and amenity offerings. Essentially, are these assets enough to make the builder under consideration attractive? For acquisition and conversion costs, Gensler, an architecture firm, and JLL, a real estate firm, recorded that office rents were averaging about $4.16 square footage monthly, while residential is only about $3.25. Although it seems small, that discrepancy often dissuades developers from taking on these sort of conversions because they're making less money. For zoning, strict zoning can be a barrier, which also dissuades property owners and developers. The DC Comeback Plan seeks to reduce zoning barriers in this case in order to increase the capacity of affordable housing. In 2020, the Practice Post-COVID Zoning Issue, released by the American Planning Association, stated that solution is flexibility, to design zoning regulations so the uses of property can be more flexible. And lastly, architectural, my personal favorite. Firms like Gensler have developed algorithms to determine if current buildings are really formidable to changing. They look at things like site contacts, building form plate, and envelope. If the building scores above an 80%, the building is most likely a good candidate and will go under further review. Commercial codes and architectural makeup for commercial buildings are often very different than residential. So this is what makes finding a perfect candidate really challenging. And quickly, I have many case studies in my paper, but these were three of my favorites. So the first one is the Watermark Apartments in Navy Yard, DC. Originally, it was home to GSA. It was a building built in 1976. And as Navy Yard continued to grow and add amenities like restaurants and retail and entertainment, the development company saw an opportunity to seize this trendy high-end market. It's a great example of how the combination of vacant space, need for more housing, and a newly vibrant area that had mixed use and walkability was basically screaming for this conversion to happen, and it was quite successful. The next is 20 Broad in New York City. It was formerly an office space, part of the New York Stock Exchange, and its location near Wall Street and Broad had lots of restaurants, arts, and shopping, so it made it already a very desirable area to be in. In this case, they were able to add density, which was to their benefit, adding about 6 floors to the top of it. And they were able to keep some of the historical elements while adding modern furnishings and amenities, contributing to the consistent character and neighborhood. And lastly, my favorite, the Santa Ana Arts Collective. So it was obviously an office space as well that was built in 1965, and it was converted into 100% affordable housing in addition to both public and private amenities. It was made possible by funding from Affordable and Sustainable Communities Program, and it complied to the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance in Santa Ana, which helped to promote programs in the area to the public as well for arts and culture. And it was a great example of connecting the community around. And lastly, the what. What can conversions provide? So while conversions can help with restoring communities, they are just a piece of the puzzle. With gentrification on the horizon of almost all changing cities, this is a way to sustain some of the appearance, quality, and character. Oops. So first is economy. I have a little example here. In 1996, Baltimore, Maryland established a historic restoration and rehabilitation tax credit, which was designed to help bring investment back into struggling areas. This property tax resulted in over 2,000 rehabilitation projects and spurred more than $700 million of investment back into historic neighborhoods. For sustainability, according to the EPA, it takes about 65 years for an energy-efficient new building to save the amount of energy lost in demolishing an existing building. And building-related construction and demolition accounts for 26% of all non-industrial waste generated in the US. If architects are able to take advantage of the existing building stock and reduce demolition costs and waste, they're already contributing to a more sustainable city. Next is mixed use. Post the pandemic, people realized they could live where they wanted while still maintaining their virtual job. So what brings them to cities then? Relocation and job flight has become a really prominent theme. So it's absolutely crucial that when cities are looking into conversions, they're identifying ways in which they can create draw and allure. And lastly, downtown activation. Amenity-rich mixed-use areas have become a necessity rather than a luxury. People are moving to places where they have meaningful and curated experiences. So what is the solution and what are my recommendations? As planners, we must really rethink the city. Zoning should no longer be associated with single use, and communities really need to focus on both attraction and retention. Housing demand and supply obviously should align. So in order to do so, we need to incentivize reusing and maintaining the cities we already have. Technology is only going to become more advanced, blurring the lines between work and home. And so we really need to be prepared for a hybrid work setting to create spaces that are multifaceted and functional. As I mentioned before, single-use buildings are no longer really an option for future planning. And so my recommendation is that planning organizations come together and create study groups where they can focus on the feasibility and stock of the buildings they already have and help allocate them to developers for residential development. So conversions are not the sole solution, but they can be a part of how we become more sustainable, mixed use, and affordable. And Jane Jacobs, a well-known urban planner, said, "Dull, inert cities do contain the seeds of their own destruction and little else. But lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration with energy enough to carry over for problems and needs outside themselves." And that's it.
Any questions for Hailey?
Great job, Mr. Presentation. I was wondering if during your research you had an opportunity to explore how this could benefit HUD. I know that HUD is not known for commercial conversions, but they are trying to implement this pretty aggressive repositioning strategy for public housing agencies specifically. And with GSA being aware now of the amount of unused buildings that they don't know that they have, I was wondering if you saw, just your opinion, if you see any pathway of possibly exploring how the current repositioning tools and strategies that we have could meet conversion halfway to fill in these gaps in terms of like funding and community engagement and all of that, all of the things that HUD already has experience doing that could possibly be the last push that puts a commercial conversion into a housing unit space?
I didn't look into that very specifically. Yeah. Sorry, you're good.
I was wondering at some of the case studies that you looked at, if what were like, I know you already mentioned the main roadblocks of like zoning laws and just like conversion or whatever, but were there any specific ones that interested you? Like, oh, they got stuck on like some random ordinance or anything?
I mean, to be honest, most of the time it's monetary. I mean, a lot of the times they'll find these great buildings and they just either don't follow through with them, or it ends up taking too much time and too much money that it doesn't happen, or it takes too long, that developers would rather have a new parcel of land and start fresh. So I think the biggest struggle is monetary. I mean, we can do this. There's the technology, there's the buildings, the cities and roads are already there. It's really incentivizing these developers to take on these projects. They'd rather just get in there and do their own thing and have to jump through all the hoops of government and subsidies and zoning regulations. If the building's commercial, they have to go through so many processes to make it what it needs to be. So a lot of the times it's monetary.
Up next, I would like to invite Kristian Maldonado.
Good evening. My name is Kristian Maldonado, and I am presenting my capstone project on rethinking the Western ethos, how to implement sustainable development solutions in desert mid-sized cities. Before I continue, I just want to thank my beloved parents who are watching from Nevada this evening, and my sister and my brother, my twin brother, who have always been by my side through this entire process. And a shout out to our program director, Dr. Sandra Whitehead, and my capstone mentors, Eliza Voigt and Matthew Dalby, who are also watching. And of course, my friends and colleagues who are here. I'm in your debt. So my research is going to be focusing on how we can reimagine the existing lifestyle of the Western United States as climate change continues to ravage our communities. We're going to look at this through a three-step process. First, we need to understand the current practices and methods of the Western United States and really just how the region came together the way it looks today. Secondly, we'll look into how we can modify this Western ethos, what we need to do to kickstart real change for long-term survivability. And finally, what do real solutions look like? I will propose a new smart growth concept as the right solution. So what is the Western ethos? It's a lifestyle centered in the Western United States that's been built upon suburban ideals, nuclear families, car centricity, and property rights. What do you think of when you think of the West? Maybe tumbleweeds, single-family homes, large green lawns, golf courses for no reason. Think about it like this. The Western United States has lived very unsustainably and unrealistically for a long time, and they're used to it. So how do we change that? To better understand the background of this lifestyle, we must first look at the existing planning practices of the region. From the dawn of Manifest Destiny to the introduction of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, the region has historically experienced rapid population change and growth. As a result, sprawling communities sprawl and continue without stopping. Land efficiencies, such as golf courses, continue and exacerbate existing climate challenges and other city challenges. Sprawl and inefficiencies equals unsustainable. Although these cities are trying to mitigate climate impacts, they're doing some, but it's not enough. What challenges are these cities experiencing? This is an example of my hometown, the town I grew up in, Reno, Nevada. This was in 2011. The Collin Ranch fire destroyed 29 homes over a 2,000-acre span and was 3 miles from the city center. Oh my God, this city center. This is a 3-mile separation. This is absolutely terrifying. And the only way this fire came out was because of snowfall. This is in November, by the way. This is not in June or July. This is November, okay? So this is just horrible. So wildfires are a major issue. Other challenges, traffic congestion. This is also in Reno. This is going north to a valley that God knows why we started building in. This is insane. This is the Great Salt Lake in 2021, okay? This example here on the bottom left corner is what we call an air inversion. In desert cities, we like to build in bowl-shaped valleys, okay? Only place we can build, right? What happens over time, especially in the winter, is when you have these manufacturing plants and cars that are polluting, the air sits. And we don't get that many storms in our valleys because they're stopped with the whole meteorological shebang, but the storm can't get through because it's being stopped and it stays, and it could be for weeks at a time. So only when a windstorm comes in is when the air will come out. And it usually happens in the winter, so it's pretty terrifying. And of course, flash flooding. Other challenges, wildfire smoke also kills air quality. We kind of know that here locally recently. This is a reality that we've lived with for decades, okay? Unaffordable housing, urban sprawl, we love, And this forecast here is of the Phoenix metro area. This was 2 weeks ago. They just broke a 31-day streak of 110-degree plus weather. That beat a record in 1974 for 17 days. So this is the reality that we're all experiencing in this region. So how do we modify the Western ethos to combat these challenges? Through a comparative case study analysis of 3 desert mid-sized cities that are very similar geographically, we can begin to find solutions in America's fastest growing regions. These case studies, Salt Lake City, Reno, Nevada, and Glendale, Arizona. Please observe the following table. Population sizing of these cities are relatively similar. So are these sprawl index figures of each of these cities. What this sprawl index means is on a 1 to 7 scale, with 1 being more connected or little urban sprawl, to 7 with it being less connected, urban sprawl mania, okay? These cities, at least Reno and Salt Lake City, over 50% urban sprawl. Glendale's not that far behind. And if we look at the average housing costs and transportation costs to income, if you add these up, in Reno, 45% of your income is going to housing and transportation costs alone. In Glendale, 45, it's the same thing. It's crazy, okay? And people are okay with it. They live like this. So what should we do about it, right? Part of this is climate education, okay? People really need to understand what's going on the ground. For example, in Arizona, these hot days, people are literally, when they're in the park, they fall in concrete and they're getting burned because the concrete is the same temperature of boiling water. That's crazy. They're 3rd and 2nd degree burns. They're seeing spikes in that. Reno is the fastest warming city in the country. Salt Lake City's building, look, they're trying to build this. What is this? That makes no sense. I put Florida and California as examples on here just because these insurance companies, corporate America has said enough is enough and we're not willing to pay you back for it. Farmers Insurance just pulled out all of their policies, both existing and new. California, State Farm only believes just new homes. But if they're doing it in these climate-prone states, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah are next. They're going to fall victim to it too. The next thing is identifying immediate policy rewards, right? We need people to enact change, and money talks in this region. That's why it's built the way it is. So we need to start thinking of subsidies or some sort of reimbursement for desert landscape conversions to change your green lawn into something that's more habitable for the plants that exist in the region. Something that government or residents can do to really become sustainable. And finally, we can also build on existing policies. Again, they're doing some, but they're not doing enough. So they provide a base model. So let's work with it while we have it instead of not at all. So as a result of changing mindsets and lifestyles, what should we do? What's next? Let's start by introducing a new smart growth concept, dubbed collective communities. The collective community is corollary to the 15-minute city concept, where collective communities serve to promote equitable economic, social, and environmental solutions to desert mid-sized communities. Basically, this concept is a collective approach that addresses desert community needs while promoting a sustainable lifestyle. A chance for desert cities to survive climate change. But what does that mean exactly? So I have 4 elements here on the screen of collective communities. I will not go through all of them. Okay, it's a long list, and these aren't like all of them. Okay, there's so much we have to do, and it has to be customized to each city, and it's going to be a whole shebang. This is what I can give you. Okay, so let's start with climate. Climate is the utmost importance. Governments must enact emergency climate declarations and strict measures to preserve existing resources. We need to invest in smart technologies and adhere to existing natural resources to live more sustainably and not unreasonably. In transportation, we need to reduce car dependence and carbon emissions by creating equitable transit-oriented development. These are sustainable multimodal transit options that should be our primary mode of transportation, not just an alternative. I'm not trying to get rid of cars entirely. Okay, I understand we have to be balanced and we're Americans, right? But I'm also trying to create a balanced platter of options for us to look at. Transit should work for people, not the other way around. Historic land use patterns have placed us in a very dire situation. We need to eliminate single-family and pro-sprawl zoning codes to save our cities from becoming more unsustainable. Reforming these policies and promoting infill or revitalization development to enrich existing neighborhoods is critical for future investment. In terms of housing, stopping sprawl begins by implementing urban growth boundaries, boundaries that prohibit cities from continuing to grow and instead grow inward, kind of infill development, right? I also propose working with existing housing policies. There's a lot now with all this infrastructure money that's come in, and BIPOC-friendly policies such as House America, and requiring new developments to contain a minimum 70% of affordable housing units in these new developments. Nature-based solutions and sustainable design are also going to be at the forefront of this development, so we can make sure the collective community works collectively and not just targeted to one group only. We must think progressively and not adhere to the same conservative policymaking that has put us in this dire situation, and thinking outside of the box to make sure a collective community does work for people. So, are there any collective communities in practice? There are, which is super exciting, and they're not constrained to an ethos at all. It's Arlington County, Virginia. A lot of you might be surprised locally, Arlington County is right across the river from Washington, D.C. with my little star on the top right there. Arlington's really cool just because, it's similar to these case studies I've presented. A little over 237,000 people, over a almost 26 square mile area. Their sprawl index is 1.55. Their transportation costs are 11%. It's 28% for housing because we live next to DC. It's a whole problem. That's a whole thing we're trying to address here. I'll acknowledge that, okay? But Arlington's doing pretty well. Look, it's the fittest city in the country for 6 years in a row. It's the best place to teach. It's one of the most resilient economies in the US. It just got labeled one of the best cities you don't need a car, and that's very common in this region. For those who are not from here, it's really common. 99% of residents can walk to a park in a 10-minute radius. You can't get that in any of these desert communities that I presented to you today. Its multimodal and sustainable planning approach has had a positive impact on its populace. Again, although this city is on the East Coast, I understand. It's important to note that there's no collective community in the West Coast at all. It doesn't exist. And this approach is not having a Western idea to it is critical for Western cities to implement, not having this ethos. So we need to disassociate that kind of lifestyle and instead look more sustainable. Ultimately, desert mid-sized cities must be willing to adapt to necessary change in order to achieve a balanced lifestyle that guarantees them long-term survivability. We need to be more intent on real solutions and ourselves for our planet. The climate crisis is only getting worse. And if we don't become sustainable, which is obviously the key word of this, our futures will be negatively impacted forever. Collective communities do serve as the ultimate solution, sustainable development solution to desert mid-sized cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian. Any questions about Kristian's presentation?
Do you have any suggestions for lowering the urban sprawl number in the mid-sized cities that you referenced?
So, yeah, so it's really going to be, and I should really have put this there more, we really need to stop it. And how do we incentivize that? The big developers are going to be the first key to that, because out west, especially in Reno, its geographic location is central to Seattle and Phoenix and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and I can name every, unsustainable city that's out there. But these urban growth boundaries need to stop them from doing so, and working with government partners and local partners to incentivize this idea of infill development, looking at old brownfields that have been basically a plot of land that might have been contaminated by chemicals or whatever use that existed on there. What EPA programs, the Environmental Protection Agency, can provide the city to maybe clean it up and put something there instead. We could put like a mixed-use development with X amount of apartments. That would be fantastic, right? And doing all those things necessary to make it possible. So it's a very loaded question, but that's one component, right? But each city will need a customized approach to some degree to make that happen.
Hi, Kristian.
Hi.
Hello, is it on? Okay, hi. Hi, Kristian, great job. I had a question about if you're in your research, if you've seen any leadership in the West, whether that's in Nevada or California, well, not California, but in Nevada and like other states out there that are actually advocating for more sustainable development. I know that you used a few cities in your examples, but like, are you seeing any push for this type of development in any organizations, like grassroots organizations that are trying to advocate for this type of change in their communities?
Yeah, so water policy is huge, obviously, in this region. So you have all these water-centric groups that are trying to make change. But an example that I found is in Utah. Utah actually is in the midst of implementing a 15-minute city right outside of, I want to say it's Provo, which is a suburb of Salt Lake City, if I'm getting that all correct. And if one of the photos that I presented is actually that. So they're trying to implement 15-minute cities, which is, for those that don't know, a 15-minute city, it's this idea of a work, live, play lifestyle in a 15-minute span. So I left here, let's say this was my home, and I went 5 minutes one way, I can go to my grocery store, or in 15 minutes, I can go to work, so on and so forth. So they're trying to do that. As for other regional states, I mean, there's some stuff, but it's not what it needs more, it's really, a lot of it's political too, especially with these rural communities. You have this really big political party divide, especially in Utah, but it's possible. If they could do it, we can too.
Kristian, I have one for you online. Sorry. Molly asked, does sprawl pose as an obstacle of achieving a collective community?
Yes, absolutely. It's its biggest opponent. But if we can really tackle some of the initiatives that I've placed in these 4 elements, and potentially more as this project continues, then we can beat it.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, is it on? Great presentation. When we moved, it was because of the schools. That was the driving factor for us. Did you look at, or how does that factor in with your study, your research as far as schooling?
Nevada is the 49th in education in the United States. It's a huge component. So that is something I'm still looking into. Our reports are due at the end of August, so that's a critical, like, you know, it's a whole different leg, right? Arlington, this whole region really is really good with education. So how can we provide the right workforce programs or executive education to every population group, really? And how can we attract great minds and get our heads together for real solutions?
Thank you.
Hello. So my question is, so with your 4 elements, do you have a time span? If everything works out as planned, what is the time period of it to be successful and be something that will become the collective community that you're working towards?
Yeah, so that was actually a conversation I had with Dr. Whitehead and Professor Voigt, my Capstone mentor. We were looking at I'm very aggressive with policy initiatives, so we'll see if it's really feasible, you know, over time. But some of these changes needs to happen. They should have happened tomorrow, but we're looking between a 0. We did short, midterm, and long. The short would be about 0 to 1 year, the midterm 3 to 5, and the long term 5 to 10. So how all of this factors in is a bit difficult, but potentially a maximum tenure. And as I was speaking with Dean Riddle earlier, timeline is very difficult to set just because climate change, accelerated climate change, is already here. It's more about what we can save versus what we can avoid.
Thank you, Kristian. I would like to invite our final presenter of the night, Arletta Thirus.
Hello. Hello. I want to just say, oh, okay. All right. I've never done this before. So I'm Arletta Thirus. I'm doing mine on individualism. The previous presenters were amazing, but I'm going to get philosophical. In my time, I've been to a lot of different places. I've lived a lot of different places. I've done a lot of different things. And I've noticed that areas that have less money, that seem like they shouldn't be as like happy and like productive and just have a better way of life, are a lot happier than the US, which is a developed country, relatively rich. And I was thinking, I wonder why that is. Why are most Americans in this state of either stress, fight or flight, anxiety? What's going on? So we're gonna break down what American culture and what in particular individualism has done to urban planning in America and how that affects American individualism, American individuals. To start off, we're gonna define individualism, which is not individuality. Individuality is distinct characteristics that make you unique from others. At a community level, that makes culture. So every culture has its own individuality away from other cultures. Individualism is the ideology that emphasizes the individual. And if you go even further, eco-individualism is the ideology that revolves around the individual and their environment or their ego. So, and that occurs when people assume this sense of morality over each other. If you think you're better, you're like looking down on people now. George Simmel has a great quote that says, "Money enabled the most adequate realization of and effectiveness of every individual complication, leading to individuals defining their identity through their possession, thus becoming an extension of ego." So this defines now, our ego is now monetary. Our ego is connected to how much money we have, how much money we display, and how much money we're going to make. Money in and of itself offers you a degree of separation from others. So the more money you have, the more further away you're from people. There's more degrees of separation. In planning, historically, we have equated happiness quantitatively from benefits to cost. So the more money that you have in a planning front, but also as a person, the happier you are, which is in contrast to the common phrase, money doesn't buy happiness, when clearly it might. Individualism in American culture has manifested to make Americans too prideful, overly competitive, and too dependent on individual merit. You can really see this because at the most recent United Nations meetup, they voted on whether or not food was a human right. The United States was the only country to vote no, which is really interesting. Also, additionally, Vice President Kamala Harris openly stated that most Americans are one unexpected $400 expense away from bankruptcy, which translates to homelessness, because filing for bankruptcy also costs money. So you're just going to be homeless after that. And your environment shapes your behavior. So the American dream and the pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of money and this competition and this pride and achieving things on your own from a monetary stance. This leads to a very conservative ideology that you see in a lot of politics these days. One example is Reagan, who coined the term welfare queens. People who are on welfare were lazy. People who are on welfare made choices that led them to this environment, which we know historically isn't 100% true. Back to planning portion of this, planning theory is the balance of sociological, philosophical, and ethical judgments. So you're making assumptions on human behavior, you're making assumptions on the nature, purpose, and premises or context of something, and you're making assumptions on whether something is right or wrong. So we take all of those, we apply them to planning theory, we apply them to or case studies, and what we come and pull from that will be the results of individualism in the built environment. And I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to try and skim through my results because I have a lot. But let's start with the basis of a lot of our issues in the 70s. Planners really thought that distinct, separated communities would lead to a sense of community. That sounds insane. Separated communities would lead to a community. And additionally, they thought privatized mobility will make you happier, will give you a better way of life. Problematic in a couple ways, because both of these things require some sort of monetary wealth, some type of access to funds to get these things. Starting with transportation, historically, if you needed a resource, if a building needed, if you needed a resource or something, if you wanted something in an area, it was built in proximity to the main population. After the T-model car and after the assembly line, cities and planners saw the opportunity to actually expand things out because the land further away from the urban hub was cheaper. So things started moving out. The problem is resources and things people need went with it, and public transit couldn't really keep up. To solve that, they raised the wage that service workers got. Problem with that is this is at a time pre-civil rights movement where not all individuals in America were seen as individuals in America. They weren't seen as humans. People were still, indentured servitude kind of really was getting swept under the rug. People were still being put in camps. Black Americans had just become a full person rather than three-fifths a person. And so the main demographic of people who saw these increases in wage were white Americans. So the main people who could buy a car and own a car were white Americans. This led to the mass production and priority of the car led to a hierarchy on the street, not only in terms of safety, but in terms of funding and priority in the funding. Cars were prioritized, pedestrians were to go with what they had. You see this in the funding issues, and not just Republicans, I will say, not just Republicans, but Democrats do it too. But Governor Schwarzenegger in 2009 pulled all the funding from California's public transit assistance programs, which had a huge impact on the efficiency, the fares, and the area of service for these communities. And then most recently, the Trump administration, when they proposed their $1 trillion infrastructure bill, transportation received 0% of it, despite public transit definitely needing some assistance. It got none. On the front of outside of planning, on the front of residents themselves, the better, since cars are now seen as a status symbol because they're tied to your ego because of how much they cost, the flashier car you have, the better you look. And most recently, electric cars are the new rage, which is nice in theory. The problem is electric cars, people buy electric cars for a moral sense. They're helping the environment. But if you really look at it, you have to charge a car, right? And the electricity has to come from somewhere. If you source back where that electricity comes from, it's usually coal. So 20 people in an electric vehicle charging it is actually more to the carbon footprint than 20 people on a gas bus using non-renewable gas. And then lastly, for transportation, we have highways. Highways are historically known to destroy communities. One example I have off the top of my head is Black Tulsa, the Tulsa district in Greenwood, Oklahoma. In 1921, it was an affluent neighborhood. It was an affluent, predominantly Black neighborhood or community. We'll say it's a community. And they almost known as Black Wall Street at some point. In 1921, they were massacred, lynchings, buildings burned down, homes burned down, all of that. But they were resilient enough because the culture was so strong and they had such sustainability and they were really self-sufficient that they came back. In 5 years, they were recovering everything. In 1926, a highway was put directly through the community, and that began the decay and downfall of Black Tulsa to the point that it was no longer the affluency, it was disinvested, people moved out, and it was virtually gone. And that's just an historic, like that's a trend. You'll see people do that all the time in planning. In housing, suburbia and sprawl. Sprawl is a very interesting thing because it is actually backed by the state. It's kind of a misguided investment of resources because they put money into these developments to try and better a community, but it just results in separation of communities from each other, but also a separation of communities from the resources that they may need. And so it's kind of counterproductive in a way. You won't see people benefiting from anything if they require a car. Lawns and grass, I'm sorry if you have a lawn. I'm so sorry. But there really is no point of a lawn. When people bought lawns back in the day, when people bought acres of land back in the day, it was for farming, cattle development, such and stuff. The grass that Americans use for their lawn is non-native grass, right? So it's already hard to upkeep. You have to use different chemicals that damage the ecology of the area. It requires a lot of water. And with climate change, we barely got enough of that as it is. But also, it doesn't really do anything for the carbon footprint. Grass is virtually does nothing to take carbon out of the air. So it really is kind of pointless, but it's a statement piece. And that's what matters. And finally, in housing, we have concepts that a lot of people, we throw around words like gentrification, all that, but what is it? And at the end of the day, the phenomena of people wanting to experience a different culture that has led to flipping of an area, where the people who created this culture capita and created this environment where everything was enclosed together because that's the only way that they could live is an enigma to a lot of people. So they move in, and real estate agents and landlords have really learned how to quantify this. And they'll come in, flip it, and now the people who live there are displaced and gone. But now you're paying for comfort, you're paying for access to public transit, you're paying for proximity to public resources like any public facility, parks, And even to the point where you're paying for the amount of sunlight your apartment gets. If you have floor to ceiling windows, even if you don't have floor to ceiling windows, the better lighted your apartment is, the higher rent goes up. It's really amazing how they managed to quantify comfort. On that same topic, the culture capital that got displaced, where are they going? Half the time, either to the slums, to less affluent areas, or they end up homeless. The interesting thing about homelessness and passive income and things like that is that there are 756 billionaires in America alone. There are approximately 16 million vacant homes in America. These wage increases or these profit increases that a lot of companies have, where are they going? Then we find out where they're going. CNN literally just reported that since 1978, CEO pay has increased by just under 1,500%. So clearly there's money there. But all of this, meaning we're so successful, we have a lot of rich people, but we have 586,000 homeless people across America that don't have homes. And we would rather clear out homeless camps, or we would rather build homeless villages, which really, it doesn't solve the issue. Like it doesn't fix anything. It just kind of is a slap to the face to these people who are displaced. Public spaces, historically, public spaces have really, after desegregation, public spaces really showed that back then, white Americans would rather not have a facility than to have a facility and have to share it with minorities. So they would have it shut down. Shutting this facility down just led to it being bought out and becoming privatized. The problem with privatizing something that used to be public is that they cannot discriminate, post-Civil Rights Act, they cannot discriminate based on race, sex, religion, etc., but they can discriminate on financial capabilities. So memberships or fees, fares, all that, you can discriminate on, I won't say discriminate, but you can filter out who comes in and out based on that. And historically, minorities do not have the same financial opportunities as white Americans do. So it's just a very legal way to discriminate and monitor who comes in and out of the community. On the topic of things closing down, sometimes they don't get rebuilt back up. It can lead to brownfields. Brownfields become, whether they're hazardous or not, they become a physical gap within a community. And that gap from each other can slowly lead to the decay of a community. Some communities may use it as a hub, a meetup hub, if it's safe, but if not, it's just it's a barrier between the community and the center of it. Continuing on public spaces, the concept of loitering is an interesting thing. The Oxford definition is to stand or wait around idly without apparent purpose. If you're from the South, a lot of minorities will be like, oh, that group is sitting on the stoop, which means they're just sitting out in front of something, just talking, chatting. Which means loitering to me translates to existing in a space without spending money. Which is really interesting because a lot of the arguments is that preventing loitering prevents crime. But there's a lot of planning theories that argue that the more eyes on the street, the more people in the street, the less crime that there is. So removing people from the street actually increases crime because there's nobody to watch what's happening. And then ordinances. There's different ordinances for everything, which just results in the restriction of how a culture or a community can develop. If a community is known for its loud parties, for its loud celebration, and suddenly there's a noise ordinance, it's kind of really a silent statement of, we really don't want y'all here. Some notable events in planning of individualism is white flight. The New Deal really allowed white Americans to flee from mixed race urban hubs and ensured that those minorities wouldn't be able to follow due to redlining and the classification as subclass or hazardous communities. And then the Federal Highway Act of 1956, that was 41,000 miles of highway which of many cut through communities and utterly destroyed them. But Robert Moses, who we all know and love, coined the act as a way to clear the slums. But that doesn't fix the issue of slums. It just relocates them somewhere out of the mind's eye. So what are we taking from this? As a planner, I think we face a constant dilemma of social and personal interest because we're conditioned to quantify happiness with monetary status while also fixing the mistakes of the planners of the past who were also making decisions based on monetary status. And it's like a bit of self-reflection. One of my favorite quotes is, what are you going to buy that's worth to you more than your humanity? And I think as a planner, that question really changed too. Like, honestly, as a planner, outside of money, outside of economic development, outside of profit, outside of potential affluency, what could justify making a decision that would leave a portion of the population in need? And all I ask is that as a planner, we self-reflect our decisions in a system that really wasn't meant to benefit all of us, just some. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Arletta?
Great job.
Yeah.
You give me at least something to think about for the next like 5 years. Like, how did I guess capitalism tie into this? Because like we live in a capitalistic society, so like when you're saying.
Yeah, I think capitalism is directly a product of individualism, actually, because capitalism is all about competition, free market, doing things on your own. You know, it's very much how much money can you make without the assistance of others. So I think America adopting this very capitalist system really sped up the process of individualism embedding itself, because if you look at a lot of the decisions a lot of planners make, the main goal is how much profit can this community bring in. Everything. A lot of planning commissioners will actually own real estate in the districts that they're commissioned for, and their choices and their decisions will be influenced by where they're. My real estate is on this street, so I want to build up this street and make this a main boulevard. So it manifests in ways like that, and it's really difficult to get out of that because you risk your own livelihood. If you're like, I don't want to do things for profit, I don't want to do things, for money, I want to actually help the people, you end up like a nonprofit where they're like, yeah, we don't make a lot of money, but the work is good. You're like, okay, the work is good, but like I need to live. So it's like you're stuck in this crossfire of I want to be better, but also like this system that we live in doesn't really allow me to fully be better.
Fantastic job. Thank you so much. I'm really excited about your research and hope you publish it so everyone can read it. You talked a lot about how the communities that were successful at kind of creating a higher quality of life together were pretty much systematically destroyed. So have you seen policies, especially things that we as planners can do and put in place to kind of help support that and take us back in the other direction so that we're not focused on just the bottom line and how to increase quality of life?
Yeah, there have been, especially on like the topic of highways, like highways that have gone through communities, they have started doing programs that will reconnect communities to each other and to the resources they have. And even so far as like they're looking at removing highways from certain areas to reconnect them. But I think something that you have to remember is that you can do all of that, but between, let's say, the Highway Act was in 1956, and the highway might have gone up in 1964, and they just decided to remove the highway in 2023. That's about a 60-year gap where that community is set back. It's not going to recover just from that decision alone, which is and a lot of people are like, but we're giving them an opportunity. You need to give them assistance with the opportunity. And there are programs in place for that, but they're not fully capable. Like everything is run by money. And if you don't have funding, and people don't think it's worth the investment, and historically, even to this day, people have their own biases about what's worth an investment and what's not. You really won't see too much change unless you pull out all of the biases and be like, these people need help. It's the argument of equity versus equality. You can fix what was done that's wrong, but you need to actually, like if you, how do I say this? If somebody falls and breaks their leg, you can pick them up and stand them back up, but you need to assist the leg that's broken. Something like that.
Thank you.
So that was our final presentation of the evening. Thank you all again so much for joining us. Special thanks to our presenters for 4 really fantastic presentations. As a classmate, it really inspires me just how you speak with such conviction. And we talk about fixing the planning mistakes of the past a lot in this program. And seeing the 4 of you, it really gives me hope as a future planner that we will be able to do that. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you all for joining us. And if you'd like to join us out in the lobby space again for a closing reception, we can all go warm up a little bit. So just, thank you all for coming.